Ella stood at the edge of their small vegetable store, her hands rough from years of toil. She stared out into the busy market as her mind drifted back to a time before life had felt like an endless struggle. Her father's laughter echoed in her memory, the way he used to lift her onto his shoulder when she was small, pointing to the wide world across them. Back then, she did not know what it meant to want, to need, or to worry. But things had changed. Her father had always been a hardworking man, but he was also a man of simple means. He owned a small plot of land outside the village where he grew vegetables to sell at the market. Life had been difficult, but they had each other, and that made everything seem bearable. Then 3 years ago, the unthinkable had happened. Her father had fallen ill, and the small community clinic had been helpless to treat him. Ella had pleaded with her relatives, knocking on doors, begging for money to take him to a bigger hospital. But each visit ended with an apologetic smile or an outright refusal. And so her father passed away, his last breath filled with apologies of leaving them so soon. After his death, the burden of responsibility had fallen on Ella and her mother. They poured every bit of their energy into their vegetable store, fighting to make ends meet. They rose before dawn, picking vegetables, sorting them, and packing them carefully into a basket. The morning sun would just begin to light the sky as they made their way to the market, setting up the store in hope of selling enough to cover their day's food. But the struggle was unrelenting, and now Ella's mother has begun to age too. Her body, worn down by years of labor, started to show signs of sickness. At first, it was just tiredness and a lingering cough, nothing that seemed serious, but over time, it grew worse. Her mother's once lively face grew pale, her body looking weak and wrinkled. She could barely stand for more than a few minutes at a time. One evening, Ella found her mother sitting by their kitchen table, clutching her chest, as sweat covered her face. She had seen that look before, a terrifying resemblance to her father's last days. Panic filled Ella's heart as she realized that her mother's illness was something that could not be ignored. She needed medical care quickly, but they had no savings. Determined to save her mother, Ella went to her relatives once again. She knocked on every door, swallowing her pride, humbling herself before her uncles and aunts. But just like before, each one turned her away with excuses. Her desperation grew, filling her with a sense of dread she couldn't shake. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thoughts rising through her mind. Her mother's health was declining, and if she did not find a way to get money soon, she might lose her too. It was during one of these sleepless nights that her friend Amanda came to visit. Amanda was a friend from the market, a girl who had always been a little rough around the edges, but with a heart of gold. She saw Ella's exhaustion. The worry ached into her face as she asked what was wrong. After hearing Ella's story, Amanda took a deep breath with a serious expression. "Ella," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I know this might sound insane, but maybe there's another way to get the money." Ella looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Amanda hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "There are men out there willing to pay a lot of money for a night with a girl. I know some girls who do it just once and make enough money to pay off their debts and help their families. Maybe it's something you could consider." The suggestion hit Ella like a slap. She recalled horror flashing across her face. "Amanda, I can't. I could never do that." I know," Amanda said quickly, reaching out to calm her friend. But think about it. You need the money. This could be a way out. You wouldn't have to do it again. Just one night, Ella, and you would get the money to help your mother. The thought sickened Ella, and she shook her head. She couldn't imagine herself in such a situation. She couldn't bear the thought of giving up on her dignity, her self-respect, even for her mother's sake. She pushed the idea away, refusing even to consider it. But as the days passed, her mother's health continued to decline. She grew weaker, her breath slower, and Ella found herself standing by her bedside helpless, feeling the weight of desperation pressing down on her. Finally, one evening, as her mother lay asleep, Ella made up her mind. She could not let her mother die, not when she had the power to save her, even if it meant sacrificing her own dignity. She went to her small closet, pulled out her best dress, a simple plain outfit that she adjusted as best as she could to look seductive. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She left the house that night, her heart pounding, her hands trembling as she made her way to the main road. She could barely recognize herself, feeling like a stranger in her own body. But her mother's image in her mind kept her moving forward, step by step. Ella stood on the roadside, waiting in the shadow, feeling vulnerable and exposed. The cool night air brushed against her skin, sending shiver down her spine as she tried to suppress her fear. She had never done anything like this before, and every instinct in her body told her to run. Each passing car made her stomach twist with anxiety. She shifted nervously, crossing and uncrossing her arms, struggling to calm herself. She wanted nothing more than to leave, to forget this night, to go back to her mother's side and find another way. But she knew there was no other way, not if she wanted to save her mother's life. After what felt like hours, a sleek dark car slowed down beside her. The window rolled down, revealing a young man with sharp features and a confident gaze. He looked at her up and down, his eyes lingering and assessing her. "How much for the night?" he asked, his voice low and casual. Ella swallowed hard, barely able to form words. She mumbled a price, though she wasn't even sure what she said. The man seemed satisfied, nodding slightly before unlocking the passenger's door. She got into the car, looking worried as they drove off. The silence between them was heavy, as she could feel his gaze on her. She stared out of the window, her mind racing with thoughts, a mixture of shame, fear, and resignation washing over her. When they got to the hotel, they made their way into the room. Inside the room, the silence became suffocating. She could feel his presence behind her, and the reality of what was about to happen crashed down on her like a wave. She felt trapped and cornered like an animal in a cage, but there was no turning back now. The man approached her, his hands resting on her shoulder. His touch was unfamiliar and unsettling. She closed her eyes, trying to block out everything, to distance herself from the situation. She felt herself slipping into a state of detachment, as if watching from outside her own body. She slightly observed her own pain when he penetrated her, though she did not know how to feel or react, but she definitely knew that it wasn't what she wanted. When it was over, Ella lay motionless, staring blankly at the ceiling, feeling empty and disappointed. She had lost something that could never be reclaimed, a part of herself that she had given away, all in the name of saving her mother. The sunlight pierced through the hotel curtain as Ella opened her eyes, feeling an ache settle within her. The events of the night before flashed through her mind, and she felt a mix of regret, shame, and sadness. Her body felt foreign to her as she wrapped her arms around herself, wishing the hurt to disappear. But the ache in her heart remained, a bitter reminder of the price she had paid. As she began to dress, Ella noticed the man watching her with a curious expression. He looked at her intensely, his gaze shifting from surprise to something she couldn't quite read. "I did not expect you to still be untouched," the man said, his voice betraying his surprise. Ella simply nodded, looking down as she zipped up her dress, her cheeks burning with a mixture of embarrassment and shame. The man cleared his throat and pulled out a bundle of cash, far more than they had agreed upon. "Take this," he said, pressing it into her hands. Ella's eyes widened as she stared at the money, realizing it was more than she had dared to hope for. It was enough to cover her mother's hospital bills and still have some left. Without another word, Ella took the money, muttered a quiet thank you, and slipped out of the room. As she walked down the narrow hallway of the hotel, she felt sick and kept her eyes on the floor, avoiding the eyes of those who might judge her if they knew what she had just done. Stepping into the sunlight, she took a deep breath, hoping that this nightmare would soon be behind her. Ella returned home, her heart pounding with a glimmer of hope. Clutching the money, she felt a spark of relief. She could take her mother to the hospital, get her the care she needed, and this chapter would become a distant memory. But as she approached the small worn-down house, she noticed the silence. It was unsettling, the kind of silence that hinted at something being terribly wrong. She stepped inside as her hands shook. She called out to her mother. There was no response. Panic washed over her as she rushed to her mother's bedside, only to find her mother lying still. Ella's heart sank, the money slipping from her fingers as she fell to her knees beside her mother with tears in her eyes. "No! Mama, please wake up!" she whispered, her voice trembling. She had done everything she could, yet it wasn't enough. The reality of her mother's passing hit her hard, and she wept, mourning not only the loss of her mother, but also the dignity she had sacrificed in hope of saving her. In the days that followed, Ella arranged for her mother's funeral, using the money she had earned. As she stood by the graveside, watching the casket being laid into the ground, she felt an emptiness she couldn't describe. The life she had known was gone, and she was left with nothing but memories and regrets. Weeks after the funeral, Ella tried to move on, throwing herself back into her vegetable business that her mother had left behind. She spent her days at the market, her hands working tirelessly, trying to restrict herself from the pain of loss. But something felt different. She began to feel unwell, exhausted, and dizzy daily. One evening, as she sat alone in her small house, Ella realized with dread what her symptoms might mean. She couldn't ignore the signs any longer. She gathered the courage to visit a local clinic where the doctor confirmed her fears. She was pregnant. The news left Ella feeling emotionally drained. She thought of the night she had given up her innocence in a desperate attempt to save her mother. Now, she was left with a reminder of that night, a child growing inside her. Fear and uncertainty filled her heart. She was young, alone, and faced with the responsibility of raising a child without a father. Determined to find the father of her child, Ella spent days searching for him. She wandered through the parts of town where she thought he might be, asking people if they recognized him based on the little she remembered. Days turned into weeks, but finally, she spotted him in a bustling marketplace, laughing and conversing with a woman who held a young baby by the hand. Ella's heart sank as she realized he was married with a family of his own. Gathering her courage, she approached him, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Do you remember me?" she asked. The man looked at her with a flash of recognition in his eyes. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. "Ella, right?" he said, his voice cold and distant. Ella nodded, her gaze fixed on him. "I'm pregnant," she said. The man's expression shifted from discomfort to anger. He shook his head, his voice rising in denial. "You can't be sure it's mine. We were together for one night, Ella. I have a family and a life. I can't take responsibility for this." His words cut through her like a knife, leaving her feeling hollow and betrayed. She had hoped, in some small way, that he might accept responsibility or might offer some support, but his rejection made it clear that she was fully alone in this. That night, Ella returned home, feeling broken and alone. She sat by her mother's empty bed, crying, as she thought about the life growing inside her. She thought of the hardship her mother had endured to raise her, the sacrifices she had made, and she realized that she had inherited that same strength and that same resilience. The journey ahead was uncertain, and Ella knew she would face challenges, but she made up her mind to keep the baby. She would raise this baby, give it the love and care that her mother had given her, and teach it to stand strong in the face of life's trial. In the months that followed, Ella poured her energy into her vegetable business, working harder than ever. Her small store began to attract loyal customers who admired her dedication and her resilience. She was no longer the shy girl who she had once been. She had become a woman shaped by her experiences, determined to provide a better life for her child. As her belly grew, so did her resolve. The whispers and stares from the villagers no longer bothered her. She was focused on the life she was building, and nothing could stop her.